Welcome to the Under the Influence podcast. My name is Alistair Kreft, and today we are under the influence of Chardonnay with Joris van Almenkerk of Almenkerk Wines in the Elgin Valley. We're going to explore this beautiful grape, and we're going to taste some wines from around the world. And today's podcast is brought to you by the Together Store, www.togetherstore.co, your number one wine and digital deli in Africa. Joris, cheers.
Cheers.
Welcome to the Under the Influence Secret Cellar.
Excited to be here.
Thank you for taking your valuable time away from your rapidly growing vineyard. It's an exciting time. And today we're going to be exploring this grape Chardonnay, which I think it's kind of like the beauty queen that maybe fell from grace and is now on the rise, exactly, and certainly not in a broad movie star type way, but in a kind of individual pockets of excellence, and with a great story to tell. So yeah, I mean, what's your journey been with the Chardonnay grape? When did you plant your
vines? We bought a farm in 2004, and then we had to decide what to plant.
Yeah,
and because it's cool climate and we had a sort of diverse soil types, we could basically choose anything.
Fantastic.
So the viticulturists that we use as a consultant said, just give me your list of grapes that you would like to plant and we'll find a suitable spot for them. And Chardonnay was always on that list, because we love Chardonnay and my dad is Chardonnay befock. It's like Chardonnay is the only white wine in the world.
But you must have grown up drinking Burgundy.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we grew up drinking wine from an early age, living in a restaurant.
Yeah.
Wines come back with a little bit of wine left in there, and people still think, even if it's white, that no, you shouldn't finish that last bit, it's sacrilege or whatever. So we got exposed to basically the whole wine list from a very, very, very early age, and Chardonnay was great because, I mean, even if you're not a wine connoisseur, Chardonnay ticks a lot of boxes because it's complex. You've got the fruit, you've got the wooding, you've got the freshness. It offers a lot. So yeah, we've always loved Chardonnay. So Chardonnay was non-negotiable, but then the trick came to find the right place to plant it. So we ended up planting our Chardonnay on the coldest site on the farm, the lowest lying point, which is sort of doesn't make sense until you understand that the cold travels on the floor of the valley and ends up at the bottom.
Yeah.
So it's the one place on the farm where we always get frost in winter. And that helps Chardonnay bud and be fertile the next year again.
Amazing. Well, I think today is really exciting because we're actually able to go on a bit of a journey through Chardonnay. And I always like to just start with the sort of blank template, which in this case is an unoaked Chardonnay.
Yeah.
So maybe let's dive in. We Alex kindly gave us a few bottles of his great wine. So we've got the Winery of Good Hope unoaked Chardonnay. And yeah, I think, we'll talk about the ABC movement maybe in this discussion. But maybe let's just dive in and just unpick this grape without any oak influence and just discuss it. It'll be great. So let's give it a whirl.
This is a very nice starting point for the discussion. Because despite the fact that it doesn't have wood, it's got a nice broad mouthfeel.
Yeah.
So clearly the winemaker's been working with some lees contact here, some souli treatment, and that just builds out the mouthfeel of the wine. So yeah, fruit-wise, Chardonnay is a bit of a weed.
So it grows anywhere. Okay.
It grows anywhere. And it does well in cool climates and in warm climates. But wherever it grows, it expresses that climate.
Okay.
So with an unoaked Chardonnay, it's actually a lot easier to find the area it was grown in. Whereas if you go to more wooded chards, it becomes more difficult.
Okay, that's interesting.
So yeah, no, lovely wine. I'm going to say slightly warmer climate, or this could be a blend of different areas. But yeah, it's got that sort of mango skin character to it. which is pushes it into the tropical spectrum, but it's also got sort of an underlying greenness. So,
No, I mean, this is an incredible lunchtime offering. I think the interesting thing about Chardonnay, because we sometimes in the hospitality side of the business, you offer a guest a Chardonnay and they're like, absolutely, I'm not interested, or they love Chardonnay, they grew up with Chardonnay. Where does this sort of anything but Chardonnay mindset come from? Something that maybe happened when we were a little bit younger.
Yes. So I think the apex of the ABC movement, the anything but Chardonnay movement, was probably in the 80s.
Yeah.
And I think there's two factors. There's the one factor that because Chardonnay was so popular, a lot of Chardonnay was planted and became sort of a glut of Chardonnay.
Yeah.
They were making it in huge quantities, not always great wine, and that tarnished the reputation of Chardonnay on the one hand. But I think another factor is also that the top producers that were charging top dollar for wine and selling it not to the big wine public, more to the wine connoisseurs, they were overwooding their wines.
Okay.
And they were making too big, and that put the wine connoisseurs off. So if you are busy alienating your everyday wine drinker and your wine nerd, then you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that just came together at that point where then everybody said, we're not interested in Chardonnay anymore.
Yeah, and then Sauvignon Blanc made a big comeback.
Sauvignon Blanc. Riesling had a dip, or a rise and a dip. And I think probably a decade after that, Pinot Grigio, Pinot Gris, has had this huge rise and now seems to be declining a bit again. So,
So I suppose the style of an unoaked Chardonnay was partly a response to that, or was that something that one could typically find in the market?
Look, personally, I find unoaked Chardonnay a difficult sell.
Yeah,
I'm not saying it's not a great wine. It's just that if your average consumer goes to a restaurant and orders a Chardonnay, he expects a wooded wine that's voluptuous, that's big, that has sort of limey undertones. And if you then give him an unwooded Chardonnay, it's going to go, but this is not what I ordered.
Yeah.
Very much like when they order a Sauvignon Blanc and you give them a Blanc Fumé, a wooded Sauvignon Blanc, they go, well, I didn't ask for this. I want something fresh and crisp and sort of lively.
Got you.
So as a producer, if you're going to make a style that diverges from what most people identify the grape with, then that's going to be a difficult sell.
Yeah.
And I think in the new world, we can clearly state that cultivar, yes, it is the grape the wine is made from, but it's also an expression of style, or an expectation of style that you create. So unwooded Chardonnays, I love them as much as I love a Blanc Fumé, but I think as a producer, it's a difficult sell.
So it's interesting to taste an unwooded Chardonnay. We're looking at the fruit profile. Cooler climates bringing out the sort of more green apple, lime, citrusy characters. Warmer climates, much more riper fruits. From an acidity perspective, it's a fairly, the acidity will shift obviously between cooler climates and warm climates, but it doesn't have that same zing as a Sauvignon Blanc. It's not going to make your mouth water and your teeth hurt.
And that's area, but it's also genetics.
Yeah.
So Chardonnay, very much like Viognier and Semillon, will, as it ripens, the acidity just plummets.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the trick is to sort of catch it before it completely falls apart. Whereas the Sauvignon Blanc and the Riesling will just maintain, they will keep that acid.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
So that, having said that, I think Sauvignon Blanc is inherently picked underripe.
Yes.
Because that's the style.
Yeah.
If you were to let it ripen to its full ripeness, it would probably be closer to a Chenin than it would be to Sauvignon Blanc.
Okay, interesting. And then just like before we get into more of the wooded styles, you mentioned that phrase lees, and a lees contact is often like one of those phrases that's like almost like machine gunned at people, and you're like, what does that mean? What is
a marketing term?
Exactly, and we talk about it in champagne as well. But what is lees contact, which is basically those dead yeast cells? What is that doing for flavour?
So what happens is, as the wine starts fermenting, whether you use natural yeast or inoculated yeast, the yeast cell will gobble up all the food that it needs for its whole lifetime. And there's about 3 or 4 generations of yeast that survive in a normal fermentation through wine. And as they gobble up these nutrients, they convert sugar into alcohol.
Yes.
So then, ironically, what happens is the alcohol is what ends up killing the yeast cells. The alcohol gets too high, and the cell wall becomes slightly permeable, and it kills the yeast cells. And then they drop to the bottom of the tank, and you get that layer of dead yeast, which is called lees.
Yeah.
Now, the cell wall of these yeast cells is damaged, but it's still closed.
Okay.
And then the process of autolysis happens.
Okay, where that breaks.
Yeah. So autolysis is basically the enzymatic breakdown of the glucans in the cell wall, and the glucans are the ones that keep the cell wall together. And then as this enzyme does its work, and this takes about 3 months.
Okay.
It releases the contents of the yeast cell back into the wine.
Oh,
so
okay.
what's in there? Basically everything is gobbled up. So your amino acids, your monoproteins, so lots of
flavor and texture,
peptins, flavor components, but also lots of texture.
Okay.
Definitely.
Okay.
So the Chardonnay mouthfeel comes from the dead yeast cells.
Got you.
And it's a beautiful process, but a lot of guys will sort of sell this as we've left it on the lease for 1 or 2 months. It's pointless.
Okay.
Yeah. So
It's
it
gotta be
really
longer.
needs to sit in barrel for 9, 10, 11 months to really get the most out of it.
Fantastic. Okay, so and then you obviously stir that up, and that lees contact happens through that process of stirring.
Well, it's a very good point. The stirring. So the bâtonnage, and some people have special tools, and others use their putter or their 9-iron to stir it up. So what the bâtonnage does is it basically kicks it up.
Okay.
Personally, I don't like bâtonnage because you open it up, you expose the barrel to oxygen.
Got you.
And then you stir it some more to mix in the oxygen, and then you close it up again. So I'm more a fan of rolling the barrels.
Oh,
so
great.
we keep them closed. We take them off their shelf and we put them on 2 rails.
Oh, I got you. Like a skateboard kind of with like wheels.
No, it's like two wooden beams.
Yeah.
And we just roll it the one way and we roll it back. And then it's done its job. And there's movies on YouTube where you can see people doing that to a barrel. But the one barrel has a glass side.
Got you.
So they roll it and they roll it back, and then you see how that lees sort of
it's like a cloud that suddenly emerges.
And what you're kicking up is the fine lees. So the very fine lees that sits at the top of that lees layer. And that's the stuff you want to kick up. The thick lees that sits at the bottom, you don't want to stir that up. Because that's where your reduction comes from. The rotten eggs and the sort of
dirty
sulfury. So you don't want to kick that up.
Okay.
So stirring it will kick it up, whereas rolling it only kicks up the fine lees, which is what you want.
Amazing. Really interesting.
Okay, I'm going to go even deeper into that.
Go, Joris.
You must tell me if I'm nerding you out. But we've actually, year on year, we are doing less and less of the rolling.
Okay.
Because we find that the least contact gives you that extra mouthfeel, but it also hides the freshness of the wine.
That's interesting.
So there's a balance that we're trying to find between the freshness and the mouthfeel, that creaminess. So every year it's basically a game of giving it its role, and then waiting and tasting it and tasting it.
And I suppose doing it on individual barrels and not others, then you can taste and blend accordingly.
So my practice is to taste all the Chardonnay barrels every 3 months.
Yeah.
And we'll taste them, we'll rate them.
Yeah.
But we'll also, some of them will be a bit reductive, and we do a rack and return. We take the wine out of barrel, we put it back in.
Okay.
And the process, we give it some air. Others might be showing beautiful concentrated fruit, but are slightly underwooded because we've used the older barrel. That we will then swap for a new barrel.
Got you.
So by doing that, by playing around a bit, you can actually get every barrel sort of to the level you want.
Got you.
Because if you're a small operation, you can't afford not to use a barrel.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Well, we're going to get more onto the winemaking side. I think what I wanted to do now is move from the blank slate unoaked Chard into the origins of Chardonnay. So we, for a Friday morning, it's not too bad to be able to open up some great wines. And we've got an example from Burgundy. Thanks, Joris. Cheers. So what do we got here?
Chassagne-Montrachet. So it's a Burgundy wine. Burgundy has a couple of areas.
Yeah.
And one of the well-known areas is Chablis,
Yeah.
which is the northernmost
Yeah.
area, and there the Chardonnays tend to be unoaked.
Yes.
Like the first one.
Yeah.
There is a movement towards more and more barrels, but if they do use barrels, it's going to be very old barrels.
Yeah.
But very much like the first wine, the Chablis wines have that mouthfeel.
Yes.
And that's the least
From
contact.
the least contact.
Yeah.
Okay. Amazing. Yeah, and the Chablis wines, as far as I understand, are very also lean, mineral.
Yeah.
They've got that lovely
tight.
like limestone soil up there.
Yeah. Look, they're closer to Champagne
Yes.
than they are to the rest
Yes.
of Burgundy.
Yeah.
So you can expect that sort of zingy freshness. And but what we're tasting now is a Burgundy wine, a Burn. Is it Côte de Burn? Is it?
Not 100% sure.
Côte d'Or. Yeah.
Côte d'Or.
So apart from being a brand of Belgian chocolate, it's also an area in France.
Is that the Golden Slope?
Yeah, basically the golden area.
Yeah.
Hooky.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're going into from here on, we've got 2017 vintages, which is quite interesting to be able to taste. So what I think the fact that many of the Chardonnay producers in the New World in the 80s called their wine Burgundy, white Burgundy,
Yes.
is an indication of the clock of Chardonnay ticks to the time of Burgundy. It's very much the sort of the pinnacle of Chardonnay. And I suppose if you've had a lot longer to practice something, then you can reach that. So it's a combination of time and obviously terroir, like what they have in terms of soil and climate. But yeah, what makes Burgundy so special as a region?
Climate is one.
Yeah.
The fact that the area is split up into very small areas, very small pockets.
Yeah.
That over the years they've worked out make the best Chardonnays.
Yeah.
So not all Burgundy wine is top class.
Yeah.
But the stuff that they make well, they do really, really well. And that can be said about all French wine.
Yeah.
I mean, France makes arguably the best wines in the world, but they very certainly make the very worst wines in the world as well.
If you go to the bargain basement section of a Carrefour or like a supermarket in France, it's pretty rough, rough stuff. Yeah.
And I think that's what distinguishes South Africa from France.
Yeah.
You'll struggle to find a bad bottle of wine in South Africa.
100%.
Over any price range.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas in France, it is really a bit of a mixed bag.
Yeah.
And often it's a cat in a bag in the sense that you don't know what you're buying until you've opened the bottle.
Yeah, or cat peeing in a bag, but that's more New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. So we'll get onto that another time. So we're talking climate. It's got that continental climate. So super cold in winter, susceptible to those frosts that you spoke of.
And then it's experience.
Yeah.
Generation after generation of trying. They've taken some wrong turns as well.
Yeah.
The whole Primox debacle in the late 90s is an example.
Was that when the wines are coming back almost like oxidative?
There we are. They were oxidating prematurely in bottle.
Yes.
Because it's always been their tradition to do heavy oaking and extended lease contact and generous use of sulfur.
Okay.
And then in a move to try and become more sustainable, more natural, more postmodern, they turned down on the wood.
Okay.
They turned down on the least contact.
Yeah.
They turned down the use of sulfides. And the combination of those actually
tilted it towards oxidative.
Tipped the wine over to oxidative.
Interesting.
They weren't oxidative when they were bottled.
No.
It's just that one would expect these wines to last for 10, 15 years in bottle.
Yeah.
And they didn't.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, the world of wine is changing.
Yeah.
No one's got the time to keep a wine for 10, 15 years before drinking.
All the money.
Yeah.
Especially Burgundies.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, on the flavor side of things, obviously we expect that slightly more kind of limey, like mineral, restrained. I mean, this is the style of Chardonnay, like growing up in Belgium, that you must have been more familiar with.
Definitely.
Joris. Yeah,
definitely. But yeah, look, French wine is just, it takes a bit of getting used to. When I go to Europe, obviously I'm not going to drink South African wines, let alone my own wine when I'm overseas. So I tried and drink the wines that I usually wouldn't drink.
Yes.
And those would be French, Italian, Spanish wines. And there's always a sort of adjustment period.
Yes.
Because French wines are beautifully elegant and perfectly structured, at least the good examples, but they're not very forthcoming.
Yeah.
And my dad has a great saying. He says, French wine, you have to stick your nose in and find what you're looking for.
Yeah.
South African wine, you just swirl it and it jumps out of the glass at you. It's
That's so true.
It's opulent, it is a giving wine.
Yeah.
Whereas French wine isn't necessarily, but when you do take the time to dig into the wine, there is a lot of complexity. There's a lot going on there. Beautiful elegance. So
So it's a palate adjustment.
Yeah.
I mean,
and also it's a different mindset.
Yeah.
We had a tasting the other day with one of the wine tasting clubs that you've joined on occasion. So these and the idea was Shiraz is from all over the world. I mean, this is beside the Chardonnay topic now, but the same principle applies, is that the wines that were the most foreign to us in style were the wines that got the lowest score.
Okay, got you.
And then there was a little group off the side of the table that is exposed to more international wines, and they scored completely different. So I think if you're not used to a specific style, you find it very hard to rate it. But once you get to know those wines, there are some.
I suppose it's the same with food. It's the same with. I mean, getting off the plane as a European in Africa, you know, if the sun is brighter. You know, everything's different here, and the same applies when we travel to Europe.
So, like you said, it requires a small mind shift.
What's this concept of like terroir, the French term terroir, which is, you know, the place, the terrain, the soil, the climate. The climate in France, we all know, in certain areas, especially Burgundy, is a coup de climate. I mean, there are parts of the south of France where you'll literally boil an egg fry an egg on your bonnet. But what is it about soil? Because often, you know, in Burgundy, it's the talk about minerality, and there's a whole, you know, debate. We can go down that rabbit hole. But what about this concept of soil, and can you taste soil in a wine?
Are you asking me, or are you asking me to give you an overview?
I mean, from a
Burgundy thought.
From a Burgundy perspective, you know,
if you ask a Burgundian, he will tell you you cannot make a white Burgundy anywhere else in the world. Period. But when we just bought the farm, we had a handful of hectares of apples left. And initially we thought we were going to make boutique apples. You know, we're going to polish them, put them in a beautiful wooden crate on a bed of cotton, and then we'll sell it at premium. And we very quickly realized that apples are a commodity
game.
And nobody cares if the bloody apple comes from China, Thailand, India,
Burgundy,
Israel, or South Africa. So then our next idea was to make Calvados. So ferment it into cider and then distill it into a apple liqueur. Apple grappa, if you will. So we went to Bourgogne, where they make the Calvados, and we visited a whole bunch of producers. And the answer we got time and time again is, but you cannot make the Calvados, you do not have the terroir. And they
even a distilled product.
They fundamentally believe that terroir is what sets them apart. Now, having said that, science has debunked that completely. First of all, the fact that the claim that their soils are older than anywhere else is hogwash.
Come to South Africa.
Because South Africa's soils are millions of years older than what you'll find in Bordeaux or Burgundy. And the claim that the grapes absorb flavors from the soil has also been debunked. I mean, the root is basically a very, very fine sieve, and it can take up water and micronutrients at a molecular level. It can't even take up calcium nitrate or calcium carbonate. It can take up calcium.
Got you.
So very, very tiny trace elements make it up to the vine.
Yeah.
So if you look at that distinct filter between the soil and the root, so all that can really influence what's happening in the grapes is the concentration of calcium, the concentration of nitrates, the pH of the soil, the acidity level of the soil can determine,
and how water drains or doesn't drain.
But from a purely scientific point of view, you could quite easily copy paste the soils of Burgundy or of Elgin into a pot and very closely control it to emulate what they or we are getting. So soil composition makes a difference. Why? Because a clayey soil will hold more water, and a sandy soil will let the water drain out. So the amount of water that's present is determined by your soil type,
and that's concentration basically.
Concentration in the grape, it's also got to do with vigor and the tipping point. So a vine early in the season will grow vegetatively, make its shoots longer and longer, and then at a point it'll switch from vegetative growth to reproductive growth, ripening the grapes. And that point is predominantly determined by the season and the availability of water. Because the vine, I mean, if we look at what the vine's doing, it's trying to make its fruit ripe and as attractive as possible to birds so they can procreate. So as soon as the days are getting shorter, sort of third week of March, and or water becomes less available, they will go, okay, I need to ripen my fruit so I can make myself attractive to the birds. So the looking at that, soil type influences water availability. Soil type influences the amount of micronutrients present. Soil type determines the pH of the soil. So yes, soil makes a huge difference. But to say that soil is unique to a place, that I don't.
Okay, got you. Let's talk Old World versus New World. I suppose we all know that the grapes of France have travelled, and some have travelled successfully. Some have even emulated their sort of home territory, like maybe a Malbec in South America, having travelled from Bordeaux. But now we've moved to Australia. We've got a beautiful Henschke Chardonnay, a Croft Chardonnay from Adelaide Hills, and I think I chose this wine, based on the fact that it's a New World winery, and we want to kind of explore this concept of Old World versus New World. Old World being Europe, New World being Australia, and ironically New World being South Africa, even though we were planting and growing vineyards and making wine before our friends in parts of Bordeaux. So let's explore this. First of all, Australia is a big place. Adelaide Hills, where's that region, Joris?
So it's South Australia.
Okay, South Australia.
If you look at Australia as an island or continent, really it's only the bottom half where people live. And in vineyards terms, there is only 3 or 4 areas. So South East Australia, where you have Hunter Valley and those kinds of. And then you have South Australia, Adelaide Hills, where Neighbours was filmed.
Okay.
Important fact.
Genie.
And then you've got sort of Margaret River, that side.
Okay.
So those are the 3 sites. And then you've obviously got Tasmania.
Yes.
Which is little island
further south, cooler. Okay.
Where the Tasmanian devil comes from.
Exactly.
So very, very cool, by the way. It's not a cool area like Elgin is a cool area in South Africa. It's a proper cold.
And I assume also like exposed to the elements in terms of do they get those cold fronts coming through similar to Cape Town? Probably affecting the weather.
So a friend of mine owns a winery in Tasmania.
Oh wow!
And he says the one thing is the wind. That freezing wind. I mean, even on a hot day, you're still wearing a wind beater. A jacket to keep that cold wind at bay.
Okay. So, I suppose if you were to just say we're going to drink Australian Chardonnay, you might expect like a buttery kind of like, just offbeat. But this is not that at all.
Not at all. Look, most Australian wines, and that's sort of their trademark, are wines blended from different wine vineyards or different areas,
Yeah.
or I'm just trying to make the best possible wine
Yes.
with different components. Also because they do it in on a bigger scale
Yes.
than we do. But this is clearly not that.
No.
This is a very sort of someone's put a lot of thought into this wine.
Yeah. No, it's beautiful wine. So it's almost, I mean, for me, it's definitely sort of more on the cooler climate spectrum. Hey, Joris?
Also, I'll pick up. I mean, on the wooding there's a lot of French oak
Yeah.
going on there.
Yeah.
So they've clearly looked at what France is doing,
Yeah.
and they've emulated where they thought emulation was needed. But it's not a French wine. It's got a lot more fruit concentration. It's got a lot more sex appeal to me.
Yeah.
Possibly at the expense of that fraîcheur.
Yeah.
But yeah, the concentration is there. I think if you gave these two wines to your average wine drinker, the bulk of them would prefer the Australian one.
Yeah.
It's just a lot sexier, a lot
Yeah.
more attractive.
Yeah, more opulent in flavor profile. So the French obviously gave us Chardonnay, but they also, in many respects, in many Chardonnays, also give us the container or the vessel that it ages in. So it seems like some varietals just have this affinity to oak. Think of Cabernet Sauvignon on the red side. Chardonnay, it just and from a anything but Chardonnay perspective, it just sucked up all that vanilla, and it was just a sort of fruit bomb and vanilla. Yeah. But what's happening with oaking in Chardonnay? Like, what are some of the trends? And this is probably a combination of new French oak, and there's definitely some older wood in there. I would assume it's not overtly dominated by oak at all.
No. But I mean, the wood's clearly there.
Yeah.
But they've balanced it out beautifully, and I think what's happened, partly on the back of the revival after ABC, and also partly because we've gotten cleverer about how to do it, is the initial reaction was less wooding.
Yes.
And that's what we've seen in the 2000s.
Okay.
And 2010s for that matter. And what we're seeing now is a sort of revival of the wood.
Yeah.
But with less toasting.
Okay, got you. So traditional barrel making method to curve the wood to create that flavor profile. The barrel is toasted.
Yeah.
So you're talking more about like the barrel preparation method, like more steaming staves.
Yeah. So steaming has definitely become a big thing, but also different ways of toasting it.
Okay.
So if you go back 30 years,
yeah,
you would order a barrel, and that barrel would have been assembled by a cooper.
Yeah.
In France, because it's an art, it's a craft that is handed over from father to son.
Yeah.
And if you haven't been sort of introduced into the art of assembling a barrel, you'll probably make a barrel that leaks.
Yeah.
So these guys really just take 27 to 35 staves, and they line them up next to each other to make sure that they will fit together, and these are straight pieces of wood.
Yeah.
And then they tie them to the first head of the barrel. They'll wet the wood, and they'll put it over a fire made of chips or shavings of the wood.
Okay, beautiful.
That they've used to plane these planks.
Yeah.
So it's a beautiful artisanal process.
Yeah.
And then depending on the area you're in and the family that's introducing the new child to the art, they will use bigger or smaller fires.
Oh, got you. So that's the level of toasting, the heat.
That's the level of toasting.
The Burgundy producers probably have a cooler.
Yeah, they use a lot smaller fires.
Yeah.
So what happens is as the inside of the wood gets heated and the outside remains cool, the wood bends.
Yeah.
And then they will introduce the first hoop, wet it again, put it over the fire again, and then bend it again until they can do the second hoop.
Yeah.
And that's how they sort of complete the whole barrel. So the intensity of the fire determines how toasted the inside of the wood is.
Yeah.
And what's happened in the last decade is they found new ways of toasting barrels. You can now order infrared barrels, infrared toasted barrels. So you just have an infrared laser doing your toasting on the inside of the barrel. They have convections, which is basically just a ceramic heated screen that gets put, to the millimeter
Wow.
a certain distance from the wood, and at a certain temperature it gets toasted. There are barrel coopers where you can order your barrel to spec, so you can say, I would like it toasted at 180 degrees for 40 minutes, and then you're going to bring it down to 140 and run it for another 20 minutes.
Got you.
So barrel specifications have changed completely.
Yeah.
Consistency has improved.
Yeah.
Because the old wine producers would order 10 barrels, I'm not going to name any producers, 10 barrels of a certain producer, and 6 of them would turn out as expected, and 2 of them would be superlative,
Yeah.
head and shoulders above the rest,
Yeah.
and 2 of them would be worthy of the old distillation.
Yes.
And they couldn't figure out what it was, and it's just there wasn't any consistency.
It's our French friends just
Yes.
putting South Africa at the back of the queue. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And the same could be said for our Portuguese
Yes,
friends
for the
where
corks.
the corks
Yeah.
are concerned. But nowadays, you can basically just, you can confidently order the same barrel as last year and
Yeah.
expect to get the same outcome.
So that relationship between the cooper and the winemaker has, I think, also become a little bit more direct. I mean, you've traveled to France,
Yes,
and
yeah.
you've got that relationship. And then, much like a fruit tree that's grown on a certain slope versus another slope, it's going to have a different impact in terms of that fruit. The same applies, I assume, to the oak itself. You're going to have tight grain, different profiles, depending on the forest.
A funny thing has happened here. So we would order barrels from the center of France or Allier or a certain forest, and that would be the barrel.
Yeah.
And nowadays they've done away with that classification, so you can't order an Allier barrel anymore. The only thing that exists now is medium and light, it's coarse, medium, and tight grain.
Oh, I see. So they've gone more towards the
So they
grain
get the trees from
and
the
toasting.
different forests,
Got you.
and they scan this infrared scanning.
Wow.
They scan it and they determine what the density of the wood is,
Got you.
and based on that, you purchase your
Got you.
barrel.
Okay.
Because you could argue that if you have a slope and there's a tree growing on top,
Yes.
that hasn't got a lot of access to water, it'll be a slow grower.
Yeah.
It'll have a very tight grain.
Yeah.
And 20 meters from there,
Yeah.
you could have an oak tree next to a stream
Yeah.
that has grown as tall as this one has in half
Same
the
slope,
time.
same forest,
Yeah.
totally different.
Yeah.
Got you. That makes a lot more sense. So you basically sourcing barrels based on the grain, and then also based
And
on
you
the
can dictate
toasting.
the level of toasting.
Got you.
And this is where it's become interesting, because nowadays you can order a light or a blonde toast
Yeah.
that cannot be achieved by a fire.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
So we can go even lighter in toasting than ever before.
Got you.
So now we can get away with more wooding
Yeah.
and less toasting.
So that's more wood, but less of that vanilla, which you often get from the toasting side.
I think the mistake the wine critics made in the 80s is they didn't make a distinction between wooding and toasting.
Got you.
The reality is that the wines weren't over-wooded,
Yeah.
because wood only imparts tannins.
Yeah.
They were over-toasted.
Got you.
So taking away that overt coconut and vanilla and toffee characters actually made the wine so much better. And clearly this is what they've done here.
Yeah, it's beautifully balanced.
Yeah.
And so you want that balance of, because I think the misconception of Chardonnay is it's like a blank grape. It's a blank canvas.
Yeah.
But we've obviously tasted how the grape, the fruit, does have different flavor profiles, acidity, depending on where it's from. But now the complexity does come into play from an oaking perspective. And that's, so I mean, from a winemaker's side of things, if you compare making your Chardonnay to like making a cab, or, I mean, obviously Pinot Noir gets probably very complex, but it's not a recipe. It's not a simple recipe. It's a proper nuanced process to make a great Chardonnay.
I think there's certain choices you have to make in the winemaking process that are paramount, and a lot of these are made before you even get the grapes in.
Yeah.
It's barrel selection. It's when you're going to pick. Picking time is crucial.
Yeah.
Those are probably the two most important decisions where Chardonnay is concerned. And then, how dirty do you allow your juice to be.
Okay, got you.
How long do you let it settle down?
Yeah.
How clear do you want it? Makes a huge difference. And then your treatment in barrel is about, how often do you stir or roll it? Or do you just walk away?
Yeah.
Do you allow for malolactic fermentation?
Yes.
Which lowers the acidity but adds complexity?
Yeah.
Or don't you? So those are all choices you have to make.
So all these decision trees have basically further decision trees as you go along.
In Elgin, we have a yearly, it's now become a 2-yearly Chardonnay colloquium.
Yes.
And that is basically us showcasing our Chardonnays, but in a technical forum.
Got you.
So the winemakers get together and we
You must love that.
Our winemaking.
Nerdy is all hell.
I love it. I love it. We get together and we discuss the different ways of making the Chardonnay.
Yeah.
And the one thing it's done is it's made our learning curve a lot steeper.
Yeah.
But it's also sort of brought this different ways of making Chardonnay in Elgin closer together.
Great.
So it's
golden
more
thread
aligned.
now.
There's a golden thread, and we've learned from other people's successes and from other people's mistakes.
Yeah.
I mean, as winemakers in Elgin, and this is probably as opposed to a lot of other areas, we get together on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And the most beautiful tasting is the one just after harvest.
Yeah.
Where we bring our worst tank. Every winemaker brings his worst tank.
I
the
love
one
that.
you're not proud of.
Do you think anyone cheats?
It takes a lot of guts
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah.
But once you start understanding the process, you have to participate.
Yeah.
Because someone will have had the same problem that you had at some point, and will have resolved or overcome it. So you can learn from other people's mistakes.
I love that, and I think it also reflects a valley in Elgin that's very when you're a farming valley first, because you farm fruits, you farm grapes, then you have to get on with your neighbor, and I love that. It's you strip the ego out and you bring your worst tank. I need to join that. So now we're going to move.
It's not a pleasant tasting.
No, but that's how you
not
learn.
A fun tasting.
That's how you learn. It's like the same in business, the same in life. It's often the hard moments that where you learn the most. So I can imagine a reductive tank or something like that is where you get a lot of lessons. So we've basically gone from unoaked to Burgundy in France. We've gone to the New World in Australia, but now we're gonna come into South Africa. We're gonna dive into your 2017 Chardonnay, and then we're gonna move into Stellenbosch Chardonnay from Radford Dale, and it's going to be really interesting just to talk about 30 kilometers difference in terms of driving from Stellenbosch, which is a very well-known Chardonnay area, certainly one of the more established, into Elgin, on the relative scale fairly new, but definitely recognized as one of South Africa's top Chardonnay producing regions. Different altitude, different climate, different soils. Let's do this. Cool. So we're going to start with the Almenkerk.
Okay.
Thanks, Joris.
So this is the 17 vintage all across, and 17 was an interesting vintage in South Africa because it was a cool vintage.
Yeah.
And what we found is that when we picked the grapes, the acidity was fairly high. And acidity in a grape is made up of tartaric acid and malic acid.
Okay.
And the tartaric acid is pretty predictable every year.
Yeah.
It's the level of the malic acid that can
Yeah.
vary quite a bit.
Yeah.
And in 17, the grapes came in with high malic acid.
Okay.
So
and that's that green apple kind of acid in terms of it's like.
So malus is apple in Latin. So it's and Afrikaans it's called appelsuur.
Okay.
So there we go. Apples definitely. So this is the 1 year where we've allowed a little bit of malolactic fermentation to take place in 10% of our barrels, to soften that sort of.
So malolactic fermentation as a rule, that was probably going on in the 80s in terms of creating malic acid being converted to lactic acid, green apple flavor and texture into buttery diacetyl, the sort of milky character, and that's still used by winemakers, but it's certainly not as fashionable as it was.
So when I was learning my winemaking at the different wineries I worked at before we started our own, the consensus seemed to be that because South Africa is such a warm, relatively warm climate, the acidity in the grapes is precious.
Okay.
So on a white wine, you would never do malolactic fermentation because you want to retain that freshness and
otherwise the wine gets too flabby and
Whereas the French, as a rule, will let all their Chardonnay go through malolactic
otherwise
fermentation.
your teeth will shatter.
It'll take the enamel off your off your teeth. So the Mallow was not something that we'd ever considered. But then you find yourself in the coldest wine growing region in South Africa, and all of a sudden you see that your malics are actually quite high, and you can taste it in the wine. I mean, we fermented the wine; it was sitting in barrel, and usually what we would do then is we would top it up and add a bit of sulfur to stop the fermentation and to prevent malolactic fermentation. But when we tasted the wines, we found they were still quite sharp. So we let about 10% of the barrels go through malolactic fermentation.
Perfect.
It softened it.
Yeah.
It adds that sort of buttery, creamy layer. And it just made the wine a lot more interesting.
And have you done that in subsequent vintages, or was it?
No, we haven't had to. Okay. So this is the thing.
Colder
you can have a recipe. And you can decide in a recipe before the harvest that this is what I'm going to do. But you need that flexibility of mind to be able to say, hang on. We need to change something here. We need to adjust. And you always be adjusting during a vintage. But I mean, when we do those tastings with the winemakers, a lot of the times we'll ask each other, like, how do you do this? How do you do that? I have no qualms about telling someone how I made this wine. Because I couldn't even make the same wine from the same grapes in a subsequent vintage. So if they want to then try and do this from grapes from a different vineyard in a different vintage, it's never going to be the same. So if we can learn from each other, great.
That's brilliant. This is delicious. It's got that slight like brioche kind of, but very subtle, with lots of citrus coming through too.
Yeah, but this is the one vintage where we got that little bit of sort of butteriness, creaminess coming through more than other vintages.
It's great from a food perspective too, to have that subtle complexity.
Broadens out the wine. But as the Henschke, unapologetically oaked. There's a lot of, there's almost like a grippy, a pithy character to the finish, but not necessarily overly toasted.
It's got a slight savoury element to it, which we spoke about the other day. When you find a savoury element in South African wines, for me that's exciting, because then it sits somewhere on the spectrum of old world versus new world. It bridges that gap beautifully.
But savouriness is diametrically opposed by sweetness. So the first condition is that the wine is dry. And in South Africa, that's already a big ask. A lot of the wines have a bit of residual sweetness. And it makes the wines beautifully attractive. But they will never achieve that savouriness.
And sometimes difficult to finish a full bottle if it's got a little bit of RS.
It can be a meal in the bottle.
No, well done. This is really beautiful.
We like to make dry wines. And the definition of dry has changed over the years, but I think your interpretation is the correct one. Is if you can pick up savouriness, then it's dry enough.
No, and then the acidity that you get in the cooler climate, it just refreshes the palate. It just gives it the wine that focus. No, well done. That's a beautiful wine.
Look, talking about food wines, this for me is a bit of a hybrid wine. Because in the sommelier's school of thought, there's either you take a wine and you oppose the food. You
contrast.
You cut through the creamy sauce, the fatty fish, the richness of the meat by using a fresh wine. Or you complement. You take that richness and you find something rich to sort of match it. And I think that's where Chardonnay is unique, especially Chardonnay from cooler areas, is because they offer both. They have that freshness to cut through, and they have that boldness, that richness to match.
I think that's a very, very good point. Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, you were born in Europe, so it's quite a journey, I suppose, to change your perspective on South African wine, but doing it in the trenches, not just tasting it, actually growing and making the wine. But it's also very rewarding when you taste wines from South Africa that have that old world finesse and a little bit of that austerity, maybe savoury elements. But then, I mean, who doesn't love New World fruit? It is incredible. It's often opulent and, as you said, sexy. It's delicious. So yeah, to get those two in balance.
See, that's what we're trying to do, and probably what everyone is trying to do. But, I mean, when we came to South Africa to make wine, the idea was not to make French wine in South Africa. No. That'd be pointless. And you might as well do it in France. The thing is, we want to bring that fruitfulness, that beautiful concentration of fruit, but yet package it in such a way that it has that structure and that finesse of a French wine. And that's why Elgin was a no-brainer. Because it's closer to Europe in terms of climate, and it gives you that slow ripening of the grapes and the beautiful integration of the tannins in the pips before you pick it. And at the same time, you don't have that sort of elevated alcohol.
I mean, you don't, and the acidity. I mean, that's the thing. In Elgin, we don't have an acidity issue, which sometimes you get in a warmer climate. But sometimes we might have a ripening issue. I mean, because it does have a longer hang time. But that's I think a
but that's maybe positive. Where we can talk about leaf roll virus. Quickly. Because a lot of the vineyards in South Africa are infected with leaf roll virus. And leaf roll virus isn't really such a big handicap if you're in a warmer area, because the grapes will ripen. And usually they will ripen before the symptoms of leaf roll actually manifest.
Oh, that's interesting.
So what happens is slowly, later in the season, the leaves tend to curl up, the leaf roll that we're speaking about, but also the flow of the photosynthesis from the leaves to the bunches gets constricted. So there's no more food, no more sugars going from the leaves to the bunches, and that slows down ripening dramatically. Now, in the case of Chardonnay, what happens is you get to about 21, 22 bulling, which is a potential alcohol of 12%, and then the vine just pulls the handbrake
and just plateaus.
It just levels off. So in terms of making the wine, it's fantastic because you end up with a low alcohol wine. The problem is that the concentration isn't there. The physiological ripening doesn't happen. The tannins are a bit awkward. So leaf roll is a big problem in South Africa, but more so in Elgin, where the ripening happens so slowly.
Got you.
So we can't really afford to have leaf roll in our vineyards because the grapes will never ripen. Whereas quite often in the warmer areas, they will get to the sugar that they are looking for to get 13.5% wine before the symptoms of leaf roll actually start putting the handbrake on that ripening.
Got you.
So Elgin is great because our vines are clean. Virtually every grape grower I know in Elgin does roguing. As soon as they see a vine with leaf roll, they will pull it out. They will pull out the neighbors and replant or not replant. That's their decision, but to prevent it from spreading.
I mean, it doubles in terms of infection rate every year.
Yes,
number of vines.
And we've just had a global epidemic, so we know how exponential growth works. So we try and keep the R factor under 1. It's funny how that makes sense now.
It does.
It does. Mean, if I said this a year ago,
what's the R factor?
What's R factor?
Well, the R factor of COVID is definitely on the up and up. But so we need to start looking towards the last Chardonnay.
Cool. So let's just pour the wine.
Let's do this.
So the thing about making it is, as opposed to all the other wines, especially Sauvignon Blanc, we will pick the grapes, we'll sort them meticulously, because we don't use any preservatives, any sulfites
I see.
during the winemaking process. And the reason for that is we want the wine to go through natural fermentation.
Got you. So if you add sulfur, that kills the wild yeast.
You kill the wild yeast, and then you have to inoculate with a commercial yeast.
Yeah.
Which is also fine. A lot of producers do that, but then you can arguably, if you add a commercial yeast to every barrel will end up being very similar.
Yeah.
Whereas with the natural yeasts, there's not just one. There can be 3, 4, up to 9 different yeasts doing the fermentation at the same time in the barrel.
Yeah.
So after, I want to say 3 weeks, because that's usually what it takes, but some start fermenting after 3 hours and finish in a week, and others only start 3 weeks into barrel and finish 3-4 months later.
Yeah.
But at the end of fermentation, you're sitting with, say, 24 barrels that are completely different. They have their own personality. They've developed differently over time, and then the blending process starts. And blending is fun, but it's almost counterintuitive. With a red wine, you would either take your best barrels and put them together and then see what you need to add, or you would choose a backbone, like a cab that has lots of tannins, and use that as a skeleton to hang the sort of red berry-like fruit of Merlot on it, or the spicy meaty characters of Syrah, or the sort of the sweet plum of Malbec, or the sort of the riper, the greener characters of a Cab Franc, and you play around with it.
Yeah.
And whatever you add just adds to the complexity. Chardonnay is completely different. You can take your best 2 barrels, put them together, and the bottom just falls out. And it's like a blur wine. But then you add the 3rd barrel, possibly a barrel you weren't all that happy with initially, and it just lifts the blend again.
Incredible.
So you have to really go through the effort of trying all the different permutations to try.
So your blending tastings must be a table full of samples.
So it's a 3-week process, and we're actually going to we're starting next week.
Oh, cool!
And it's every morning.
When the palate is at its
freshest, from sort of 9:30.
Not allowed to brush your teeth.
No, we
early.
we counter it with a glass of wine.
Got you.
9:30 to 11, and we taste a whole bunch of different permutations. We choose the 2 or 3 best that we thought were standing out, and then those get reintroduced the next day, graduate to the next day, where we try different combinations or permutations of those 2 or 3. And then the exercise really ends when I can't taste the difference between 1, 2, and 3 anymore.
So it's like a World Cup knockout phases. Pool phases, and then knockouts, final, and then you 3.
Yeah,
it's great.
Semi-final, and it's not a flawless process, but it's what we do, and it's a lot of fun to do it. So we don't add any preservatives because we don't want the yeast to die. But also because, contrary to Sauvignon Blanc, we want hyperoxidation. So with Sauvignon Blanc grapes coming in, you'll add dry ice at the crusher,
protect it,
and add a bit of sulfides and possibly some ascorbic acid, some vitamin C, and you basically protect it from any possible exposure to oxygen throughout the whole winemaking process, to preserve as much of the flavor components as possible. And as a consequence, you have to keep it in tank without any headspace, and take the whole sort of pedantic process of oxygen exclusion through to bottling. Whereas with Chardonnay, you are going to put in a barrel, which it's basically a thin layer of wood that has that slow fusion of air at 21% oxygen. So you are going to introduce oxygen into the wine. So the thinking with what we call hyperoxidation is that you get rid of all the elements that would otherwise oxidize in barrel anyway over the 9, 10, 11 months that you keep it in barrel.
You toughen it up.
You're buffering it against oxygen. It's like with kids, you know. You want to be a perfect dad or mum. You keep your kid away from all the dirt, and then they won't get sick. Which is a great approach, but then you must accept that you're going to have to protect your kid for the rest of its life for that.
Yeah.
Whereas if you allow them to play in the dirt from a young age, they get used to all the viruses and the bacteria that are around them, and they're toughened up.
Yeah, that makes so much sense.
So that's what we're doing with Chardonnay, because they're going to be out there and they're going to be exposed.
And it's definitely more of a trend for the like artisanal producers. I mean, we've got Radford Dale in the glass. I know that they also do wild fermentations, and I love the idea of the sort of complexity of an army of diverse yeast soldiers doing their thing versus like a mono-cultured yeast, where even on the packet it often says, you know, you're going to get like red fruit or this. Yeah. So now we're down in Stellenbosch, which is, you know, 30 k's from South Africa, I think.
From Elgin.
I mean, from South Africa. It's like Marion Island or something. But this is, you know, Stellenbosch is obviously an iconic wine region in South Africa. And it's difficult to say Stellenbosch is Stellenbosch because you've got these mountain ranges, you've got the ocean, you've got...
It's one of the biggest wine areas.
It's incredibly diverse.
From the coast, from Strand, basically, all the way to Paarl.
Yeah, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, and apologies, Alex, if I'm getting this wrong, Alex and Jacques, but I think their vineyard is near the cellar. It's sort of more towards the coast,
south of Stellenbosch, between Somerset West and
which is great from a Chardonnay perspective because of that you're getting that cool breezes coming in all the time. So I mean, this is, but immediately for me it is that. I mean, it's extremely elegant Chardonnay, but it does have that riper fruit coming through.
Yeah, so. Whereas the Almenkerk was more citrus based, this is sort of more stone fruit. Beautiful fresh peach flavors coming through. And then again the wooding's there. I know Alex is the importer for Chassagne barrels.
Yes.
So I'm going to take a wild guess and say that there's a couple of Chassagne barrels in there. And I must say the barrels that we also use, about a third of our barrels are Chassagne. And they're great barrels. The first fills are quite sort of impressive. And then as a second fill barrel, it just becomes, I mean, virtually every second fill of Chassagne we have is a standalone wine.
Wow.
Could be bottled on its own.
Wow.
So they're beautiful barrels. Stunning wine. Is it more opulent? Definitely. I think if we had to sort of make a stylistic distinction, I would say that the fruit and the wooding of the Montrachet complements more with the Almenkerk.
Cooler climates.
Whereas the bold and sexy style of Henschke corresponds better to the Radford Dale.
Absolutely.
And I think that's something that both Alex and I would be proud of. And that's what we're trying to do here. Radford Dale is unapologetically New World. And we are trying to emulate the meeting of the two worlds.
No, it's interesting, and you know, like a producer like Radford Dale is, you know, New World. I mean, it's been nominated for New World Winery of the Year this year. But they also have a very strong heritage in the old world in terms of production techniques and wild yeast and oaking regime. And that for me, if you look at the vineyard of South Africa, it's so exciting to be able to have this complexity and range of options just from a 30-kilometer difference. Your vineyard's probably 300 odd meters above sea level. Their vineyard is probably sitting at more like, you know, 50 meters above sea level. I'm not 100% sure.
Completely different soils.
Totally different soils, different climates. And and it's interesting for me, like just sort of one of the final things before we wrap up is this concept of all the work that happens in the vineyard. This, the work that happens during fermentation, oaking, and then the assembly of the product, the wine. Isn't it sometimes difficult when you're blending, where you actually want to bottle a barrel, you know, because it is so expressive in a certain way. Whereas when you blend, you're bringing it together and you are making something that's greater than the sum of the parts. but it's not necessarily like a very specific showcase. Does that sometimes?
Look, the thing is, I mean, as a winemaker, you are your own biggest critic.
Yeah.
So you look at your wine very, very critically. You look at your barrels very critically, but I can honestly say that every year there's been 1 or 2 barrels where I go, I wish I could just bottle this on its own, and we wouldn't even have to sell it. I would drink it on my own. Yeah. But there's commercial considerations, and then what are you going to do? Add another range to your products? It's not always feasible. But the temptation is always there. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Well, Joris, I don't know if you have some words of wisdom to wrap up, but I just feel that this has been a really great exploration and I'm glad that it's been with you, such a master of Chardonnay, from drinking it at a young age in the restaurant, probably underage, to growing it. And I think it's important to understand that you've got to grow your wines all the way from the vineyard into the cellar, and then the complexity of fermentation, lees contact, oak. It's a hell of a thing to make a great Chardonnay, and you are a great Chardonnay producer. So thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge. Any words to wrap up from your side?
Look, when we first started making wine, our Chardonnay was an instant hit. People loved it. And I felt like there's an irony there, because this is the wine that we put the least amount of effort in, that we do the least amount of work with in the cellar. We basically just press it, we put it into barrel, and we let it do its thing, and then we take it out and we bottle it. So I was actually quite offended as a winemaker that this was our most celebrated wine. And I've had a change of heart since, because it's actually a compliment to our viticulture and the choices we've made in terms of where we've planted it, and the choices we've made in terms of barrels, that we can actually let this wine just do its thing without having to mess with it too much.
And do you think we, as wearing a South African hat, where are we in the world of Chardonnay, do you think?
That's a tough one. I think Elgin as an area is doing a lot of work to put a stamp on Chardonnay in Elgin. Hemel Aarde are doing very well in their own right, and they sort of distinguish themselves stylistically from Stellenbosch. But looking from a South African perspective, there's such a choice of styles and different wines, that if you're a wine consumer and you are into Chardonnay, there's really no need for you to go abroad. You can find this huge range of different styles in South Africa to please your palate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're 100% right. Great, Joris. Well, let's take these bottles and have a little lunch on the stoep together.
No more tasting, we're drinking.
No, we can definitely drink. Cool. And thanks so much for your time.
Cool, man.
Let's do this.
Cheers.